Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads for 9 books, 7 novels, 1 collection of poetry and 1 non-fiction. The Most Secret Memory of Men by Mohamed Mbougar Sarr, Senegalese writer. This is translated by Lara Vernierd. The Living and the Rest by Angolan author José Eduardo Agualusa, translated from the Portuguese by Daniel Hahn. Lalla Romano, Italian author, In Farthest Seas, translated by Brian Robert Moore, who translated the very wonderful Verdigris. Catalan writer Irene Sola, I Gave You Eyes and You Looked Towards Darkness, translated by Maura Fay Leatham from Catalan. Ana Paula Maia, On Earth as It Is Beneath, Brazilian author, translated by Padma Vishwanathan. Rawi Hage, who is Mr. Madeleine Tien, Carnival. Dra by Stacey Levine. And the poetry is The Murmuring Grief of the Americas by Daniel Borzutzky. And the non-fiction is To Hell with Poverty, John King, the lead singer of Gang of Four. So I'm going to start with the Senegalese novel, The Most Secret Memory of Men by Mohamed Mbougar Sarr. This, I think, was the winner of the prestigious Goncourt Prize in France a few years ago. It's finally made it into English and is a wonderful book. Really, really enjoyed this. So it starts off with a young Senegalese French author who has had his first book out, has been sort of a minor critical success. And he hears about this sort of almost mythical Senegalese author who wrote one book which just sort of wowed everyone who read it and really stayed with them. But then it was the subject of controversy amongst sort of French letters when he was accused of being a plagiarist, not only for the sort of more modern sources that he'd sort of quoted in the book, but there was a claim from an ethnologist that the story on which it's based is largely taken from a founding myth of a tribe in Africa. I can't remember if it was specifically in Senegal or not. And a whole sort of back and forth, supporters and opponents, get involved in this debate, and he sort of disappears, never writes again, or at least never publishes again. And our young writer this book has also sort of disappears from circulation because of the plagiarism things, but he is given a copy of it by a very eminent Senegalese French authoress. And he reads it and he's blown away, of course. And he decides he's going to get on the trail and see if he can unravel what happened to this guy, why he didn't publish any further. And it's a book really in sort of 3 sections. The first section is him meeting this eminent Greece Senegalese writer and sort of discovering the book, but also his sort of life in Paris. He meets up with a fellow African author who becomes his best friend. And there's lots of musings about writing and literature, which are really interesting, I think, here. We in no way thought that literature would save the world. We did, however, think it was the only way to save ourselves, which I think is a brilliant and very true aphorism. So the second part is he's sort of on the trail of this writer. And it gets very dark, because 6 of the people involved in the sort of backwards and forwards dispute, even some who were on this side of this author, they weren't all just his sort of opponents, end up committing suicide, which is an incredible coincidence. And there's a brilliant description which sort of implies that there's a sort of dark spirits that have been conjured up and are at work. It's never really, it's left ambiguous, and it's brilliant and it's chilling. And then the part 3, we go to modern day Senegal, where a woman has committed suicide and become a cause célèbre, and basically it looks like her cause is going to prompt a revolution of the masses. And our young writer has sort of gone back home to Senegal at the point at which this is happening, so he's very much backgrounding against what's happening in Senegal. And I just think it's brilliantly written. It keeps, it's a real page turner. It keeps moving on because it's very cleverly structured into sort of different themes and different approaches. And the guy can write. So this is what I was describing as, maybe the sort of dark spirit of this disappeared author is at work bumping off or forcing these critics to commit suicide. And there's a great chunk of it where he appears at this sort of women's dancing club, a sort of nudie bar. The day I sent my letter to Belém, the man reappeared at the Vautrin, which is the dance club. He came in while I was dancing. He was wearing a fedora whose rim hid his face. He walked slowly across the room and again sat in the back. He turned his back to us as usual, and I couldn't make out his features. But this time I took a good look at him. I noted his elegance, his slow and well-bred manners, when he removed his hat, and when he placed his coat on the back of his chair. I didn't see the purple-green aura again, but the solitude around him was as dense as before. The chair across from him was empty, ontologically empty. What I mean is that the man gave the impression that there had never been anyone sitting across from him, that all the chairs in the world across from which he had sat had always been occupied by nothingness. It was like he had reached the end of his solitude and was no longer waiting for anything. Unlike other people who endure their solitude, secretly hoping that fate or a chance encounter will dispel it, he gave the impression of knowing that solitude was irrevocable, that nothing would dispel it, that even an encounter would fundamentally change nothing. So the writing's great, the story's great, the themes are great. I mean, I just thought this was a terrific book. I can see why it won the Prix Goncourt. I think it will definitely be in my books of the year. And then finally, musing on sort of the nature of time. You're the one chasing them through time and not the other way round. People think, as if it's a foregone conclusion, that it's the past that returns to inhabit and haunt the present. But it could be that the reverse is just as true, if not more so, and that it's us relentlessly haunting those who came before. We are the true ghosts of our history, our ghosts' ghosts. So, like I say, fabulous stuff, 5 stars. And on to José Eduardo Agualusa, The Living and the Rest. So this is, he's an Angolan writer. This is a book set in an island off Mozambique, and it's a writers' conference, or specifically African writers' conference is taking place here. And so far, so much like that Argentinian novel Mona. I can't pronounce the authoress's name. I will put the link in my show notes to my review of it. This idea of writers coming together. It's quite bitchy, but they also discuss literature, all that sort of stuff. Very similar, as I say, to Mona. That's the sort of first half of the book. And I will say, takes an age to get going, to get through that section. It's pretty uninvolving. Now, maybe that's because I'd read Mona and it's doing similar things. It's really the second half of this book that sort of I got to grips with. So there's a storm on the mainland and the island is cut off, and it's sort of implied that maybe the rest of the world is cut off. So what does that imply? Is the rest of the world imploded in a nuclear sort of holocaust? Or is it that they're all dead and they're ghosts or living out their non-existence on this island? So those are the sort of two poles between which this book, or which the happenings of this book take place. And there are strange incidents within this cut-off island. So, for example, one of the young female authors at the festival thinks she's been stalked by one of the older males, a Nigerian writer, but he's in his hotel room, and yet there seems to be a doppelganger of him stalking her. And then we find out that there are actors involved in the festival. For those who don't speak the local language, the writers who don't write in the local language, their work is translated to the local language and recited by actors. So they sort of point the finger of blame at the actors, but it's not the actor either. Another happening is that there's a long dead eminent African author is suddenly seen. So, you know, has this guy faked his own death and has been alive all this time? So there's all these sort of strange goings on, and I won't spoil how that is revealed, what that is actually happening there, but it's pretty ingenious. You know, I did like it. So the second half of this novel really sort of redeems what was a rather sort of uninvolving first part. So I gave it 4 stars because it was a bit of a mixed batch. But just to give you an idea, we spend more time sunk into that unreal reality of reading. When we're deprived of it, we find the experience weird. Something similar happens if we spend 10 hours in a row reading a good novel. The moment we finally put the book down and stand up, the world around us feels fake, incoherent, not altogether solid. Isn't that what it's like? But that wasn't why you came looking for me. So, as I say, a bit of a mixed bag, but I thought the second half was really strong. Lots of interesting ideas. It's a debate about sort of colonial literature versus sort of native literature, and the sort of interdependency and cross sort of current sort of feeding of one into the other, and specifically about African literature. And I think it makes some very good points on that. So I gave it 4 stars. And on to Lalla Romano in Farthest Seas. So this is very much in the world of Annie Ernaux autofiction, and to be honest, it's inferior to Annie Ernaux. It's split into 2 parts: 40 years and 40 days. I think that's the split. The 40 years is when she meets her future husband. They're sort of courting. They meet doing ski hiking, which is literally hiking up slopes that are covered in snow, so you're wearing skis. It talks about their parents. This is sort of Mussolini era Italy. And not much is happening really. It is a sort of a seduction, but they're sort of both high-minded people. So it's not, it's more a seduction of the brain, of the mind, rather than the bodies. I mean, they're in love and they are physically attracted to each other. But the way it's written about, it's very much a sort of seduction of the brain. And then the 40 days is dealing with the death of her husband from an aggressive cancer. And I was again slightly let down by that because I didn't feel there were that many great insights into, your sort of love of your life is going to be taken away with you abruptly and sort of gouge out a deep gash in your side by being removed. There are 1 or 2 observations, but it wasn't as profound, and really the language is very simple. And I just felt the book was uninvolving, so I only gave it 3 stars, I'm afraid. And on to the Catalan novel, I Gave You Eyes and You Look Towards Darkness. Thanks to Ros from Skelly Dandling About the Books for pointing me pointing this book to me. It contains quite a few features that normally would not make me want to pick up a book. It is driven really by local Catalan fairy tales. It involves ghosts and spirits, all sorts of things that normally I don't like. But actually this was done rather winningly, I feel. So an old woman is dying in her bed of old age and natural causes. And she had the ability in life to tell people how their loved ones were going to die, in what circumstances and when. And all she hoped for was the best thing for her life was that she could die of old age in her bed in her home, which, fortunately for her, this is what's going to happen. But the spirits the family who preceded her relatives who preceded her in this house, their spirits are also still at play, present in this space, and they are preparing a meal to welcome her into death. And so we get, several generations of women who lived in this farmhouse, and they're all sort of, written about as if it's a single point in time, which in one sense it is. It's the time just before this old woman's going to pass into death. But of course, their lives stretch back, several decades. And two of the women, Joanna is the matriarch that started this clan and also sort of cursed it, because she'd struck a deal with the devil to find a good man to be her husband, and she had to give up her soul in return. But she manages to wheedle out of it, and but is always sort of has the devil on her heels, and most of her relatives sort of suffer unto the third and fourth generation. That sort of biblical thing is in play here, and it's only one of her daughters called Magrida. I can't remember exactly her name. Is it Magrida, Magrissa, something like that? She's the only one who sort of is in the camp of the Lord and Christianity and light. But she's very much on the defensive because all of her relatives, and even her husband, who is a bandit in the remote regions of the mountains there, he eventually is captured by the authorities and executed. But in her mind, he's in heaven, even though quite clearly he did some terrible things. But to her mind, so her approach to sort of Christianity and being in the light is not one born out of a sort of understanding and appreciation of the Gospels. It's very much a sort of defensive bastion against the inroads of the devil and its kin of all her relatives around her. And while they're doing the cooking, the meal, they're sort of telling stories from their past. And coming back to this point about time, it's really interesting because the author very slyly describes certain things that we take for granted, like a microwave is described as an urn that pings, a mobile phone is described as a mirror with voices, a horseless carriage is a car. This is how they're referred to constantly from the book, because this is how Joanna, the matriarch, she wouldn't have experienced mobile phones and microwaves. So by using that language, we're very much at the start of this historical era. But by the end, when the people attending the woman dying in her bed, her daughter and granddaughter, we're in the current age with microwaves, with mobile phones. But because the language has not referred to them, as I say, it's all pinned into one specific sort of era, even though there are events that precede it and follow after, which I think is really clever and really interesting. So yeah, I was won over by this. So I gave it 4.5 stars. And on to Ana Paula Maia, Brazilian author, On Earth as It Is Beneath. So her two previous books that I've read, The Saga of Brutes and Of Cattle and Men, are brilliant studies of working class men eking out existence in poverty. So it deals with slaughterhouse men, refuse collectors, these sorts of people who are sort of brutalised by poverty, brutalised by the jobs that they do. And here again, she's writing about men and masculinity and violence and the male psyche, all that sort of stuff. But it's in more of a form of a fable. And therefore, to me, is not quite a success story. It's still very good. And she's still, exclusively writing about men and writing about the male psyche brilliantly. But it is qualitatively different from her two previous books. So it's basically a remote penal colony in Brazil in which they are awaiting the arrival of the sort of prison authorities, because the population of this colony has shrunk, that they're going to close it down and move them all and repatriate them to other prisons. And all that's left is the governor, one guard, and a handful of prisoners. And they're waiting and waiting and waiting, and it gave off vibes to me of Dino Buzzati's On the Tartar Steppe, which I think the Americans have renamed The Fortress. But then it seems to be clear that no one's coming. And there's a sort of predation that falls upon this sort of completely woe-begone community, that their numbers have been falling, and eventually we find out why that is. I'm not going to spoil it. And these men sort of get into sort of Lord of the Flies territory. Only they're men, they're not schoolboys. It's really good, but ultimately it is a story. It's plot driven, it's a narrative, it's a fable. And I don't think that's necessarily quite where her stronger skills lie. I think it's more when she just gets down to the nitty-gritty of, you know, episodic sort of violence and things like that, and predation. It's in there, but it's more spread out, it's more diluted, because it's ultimately telling a story. And it's, as I say, it's quite fable-like. So I gave it 4 stars. And on to Carnival by Rawi Hage. Now, this is one of those books where it's a perfectly enjoyable reading experience, well written, couple of laughs along the way, but it left me completely unchanged when I'd finished it as when I'd started it. It sort of passed through me and left... It's not that it didn't leave an impression, because I remember it, but it didn't leave me with anything I felt was sort of worthwhile, really. So what's it about? So a kid who's born into a circus, but it becomes orphaned and is brought up by the bearded lady. So far, so Elias Canati, autodafé. When he grows up, he's a prodigious reader and surrounds himself with books rather than people. He pleasures himself rather than having real relationships, and the nature of the fantasies he uses to conjure them up are all drawn from literature. There are women in his life, but he seems to prefer to pleasure himself. And what he does as I say day job, it's actually a night job. What he does for a living is he's a taxi driver, and this book really does sort of, in a way, echo the film Taxi Driver with Robert De Niro in it. You know, giving his sort of judgment on the people. It takes place in a week-long carnival, so everyone's in fancy dress and they're all drunk and all this sort of, and they're all up for sort of, you know, strange and wonderful experiences, particularly sexual experiences, and he's driving these people to and from these places. And as I say, he's, you know, he's remarking and commenting on what he's observing. Towards the end, we get a sort of a serial killer who's sort of preying on taxi drivers. I won't spoil the outcome of that, but actually that was quite nicely tied into what had preceded it, I will say. His best friend is a political activist and philosopher, opponent of the government, and there's a sort of subplot with sort of what's happening to him. It's all very well done, but ultimately left me fairly empty, I have to say. 3 stars. And on to Dra by Stacey Levine. So Dra Dash, you know, her name isn't even fully formed, and she's not a fully formed adult character, more of which anon. So what's it short for? Is it dragon? Is it dray horse? Is it Dracula? Is it dragoon? Is it drawing, because she's really a 2D character? We don't know. So this is very much Kafka's The Castle meets Freudianism, and we don't need sub-Kafkaesque work in the late 21st century, because Kafka's the master. Kafka got there first. Kafka did it the best. And as for Freudianism, well, I don't know what your take on it, but it seems a rather outmoded sort of body or epistemology, I feel. So this is a sort of young girl. I say young, I mean she's sort of teenager on the cusp of adulthood, and in this sort of dystopian society she has to get a job, she has to mature, and the whole point of this character is she refuses to mature. That she turns up at the job centre, which is not like a job centre we have in the UK, but it's a massive structure in which a lot of the jobs themselves seem to take place, hence Kafka's Castle. She's trying to navigate her way through here to land a job, because it's not a given that you'll automatically get a job. And if you don't get a job, then it's very hard to come by drinking water. Don't really get it, but that's the logic of the book. And she sort of goes on this sort of magical mystery tour as, again, like The Castle, bumping into these people, trying to navigate her way to her appointed boss. And everyone she bumps into, she has this deep longing for. She wants basically to sit on their lap and be cuddled, because she doesn't want to mature into adulthood. She doesn't want to take that step. She knows she has to, but she's fighting and resisting it at every stage. So all these characters become Oedipal to her. She wants them to mother her or father her. and it's deeply, deeply unsatisfactory to me. And that's all I can say about this book. It doesn't go anywhere by the end. I will say, if you want a book about sort of dystopian work culture, read Charlene Ellsby's The Organisation is Here to Support You. I'll post my link to it. Far more satisfying. This was rather sort of diffuse, didn't really go anywhere, didn't seem to be grounded in anything. I think it's supposed to be satirical. I think it's supposed to be about sort of a dystopian culture of why do we work when, you know, we have a limited time on earth and a third of it spent in work, a third of it spent in sleep. We could be doing better things, which is fine, but ultimately there was too much of this sort of Oedipal nonsense, this immaturity. It's like almost when you read a book and it's got a child narrator, which is really difficult to pull off well because it's hard to get the voice right. Here you just wanted to grab this girl by her sort of lapels and shake her and say, grow up. You know, you can't fight the development. You're going to turn from a child into an adult. Deal with it. 2 stars. And on to the poetry. The Murmuring Grief of the Americas by Daniel Borzutzky. So this starts off really well. It's about the nexus between the human body, cash, pleasure, debt, commodification, how capitalism sells us things that we don't necessarily need but we think we need. And there's a brilliant line where it goes, the body, i.e. your body, the body is debt. That's the debt you carry around with. The debt in terms of your body demands pleasure to get hits, chemical hits on the brain. But in order to do that, largely you have to pay out money to purchase them. And it's brilliantly done to begin with. Really liked it. But then I found it got rather repetitive. It was using the same images and metaphors. It was using the same analysis. It was using the same wordplay. Didn't change enough for me. But, you know, I got a lot out of the first part of it. 4 stars. And finally, the non-fiction. So, music is as important to me as literature. They're my 2 abiding passions in life. And music was very central to my life as an adolescent. It's around the time of punk. I can't say I got in as an early adopter. I didn't. I came to it slightly after it already moved on to New Wave. Rock Against Racism was sort of 1978, so I would have been 14. I didn't go to the concerts, but I was aware of it. And again, retrospectively, I reconstructed it in my mind by buying books and reading about it and being into a lot of the bands that were part of Rock Against Racism. I would say that music didn't just background my adolescence. It imprinted it. You know, it's always stayed with me. Now, the difference between music and literature for me is I can't make music. I'm unmusical. I can only consume it, whereas with literature, I both read it, obviously, but I can also write it. So in that sense, you would think that literature weighs more heavily with me than music. But it doesn't at all. Music is so central to me. I always have a bespoke music playlist that I put together when I'm writing my books and things like that. Anyway, every 2 years or so, I pick up a book about a band who were fairly important in my life. We're talking about the late 70s, 80s, so a fair few years ago. And every time I do it, I come away feeling, I really wish I hadn't done that. Partly because most of them are not very interesting writers. You know, they may have lived interesting lives, but they're not very interesting writers. Also, writing about music, about sound, is really difficult. It's something I do a lot in my fiction. I write about sound. But professionals writing about sound, unless they're going to get very technical and dry, it doesn't really work. Now, John King was the vocalist, so he's not really talking about sort of guitar sounds and drums and things. I mean, it's in there, but it's not the exclusion of everything else. He's also the main lyricist of Gang of Four. Now, Gang of Four came around 1977. They were provincial. They weren't from London. Although, interestingly, the 2 lead players of the band, who were King, the singer, and Andy Gill, the guitarist, they themselves were both from the south of England and went to a grammar school, you know, a semi-posh school, slightly privileged. Their backgrounds weren't privileged, but at the time working class kids could get scholarships to these sort of posh schools, and both Gill and King did. But they ended up in university at Leeds in the north of the country, which is a very different sort of environment. and are associated far more with Leeds and the north than with what was going on in London. And their sound, to me, at the time, was very revolutionary. It was a mixture of Gill's very angular guitar sounds and a funk bass sound. So it was a really interesting combination. But they also sung about politics. They were very political. As I say, they were in part of the Rock Against Racism movement. And their lyrics were quite unlike anything else you would have heard at the time. I mean, sort of veering towards Marxism and stuff. So they had song titles like Capital, It Fails Us Now, Why Theory, History's Not Made by Great Men, It's a Factory. So there were songs about feminism, there were songs about the troubles in Northern Ireland, stuff that punk dabbled with but didn't really go the whole hog. These guys did, and with a really interesting musical sound. So I thought they were really important to me. And I'd still listen to their debut album, but that's the point. So they recorded 4 albums. You can discount the 4th because the band were falling apart by that time. So they recorded 3 albums. The debut album is fantastic, really seminal. Albums 2 and 3, well, they were so-so. I mean, on my iTunes, I had the first album, I have several of the singles, and I have literally only 1 or 2 tracks drawn from albums 2 and 3. And as I was reading this book, I realised they probably aren't that important to me as I thought they were, musically at least, anyway. So, John King being a lyricist, you think, you know, you have hopes that this guy can write. And he's a decent writer, unlike many other musicians I've read. This guy can write, but it's a very curious... They're very short chapters. And for a band that dabbled in sort of analysis and singing about symbols and commodities, very similar in a way to this collection of poetry, and the sort of capitalist nexus and things like that, he's not very analytical. He's an anecdotalist, really, in this book, which I found surprising and slightly disappointing. And alternately, you know, they were a band that were ripped apart by money, like so many bands. And again, by the end of the book, you feel, well, I've read this story before. It's the most common story in rock and roll. They get ripped off by their managers. They, you know, working class boys who make it big, they don't know how to, they don't understand how to handle money. They don't understand that everything they do, like have lunches in the studios while recording, they're paying for. They're not paying for it at the time. The food just turns up. But on the balance sheet that's presented to them after the recording, there it is. And that's all taken against their sales and their royalties. So every single band seemed to fall into this. And with them particularly, it's more ironic because they're basically an anti-capitalist band and it's capitalism that brings them down. They're really interesting postscripts to some of the chapters where really important cultural... countercultural and subcultural venues like recording studios, concert venues, places like this have all been long since torn down and replaced by corporate buildings, be they supermarkets, be they corporate offices, be they chain hotels. And ultimately, what they were singing about, they lost the war. I mean, inevitably, because music doesn't really change the world. I mean, you can point to things like Live Aid and all of that, but ultimately, music, and probably all art, has very little impact on the political nature of the world and affecting change. So it was quite... It's one of the better music biographies, or autobiography in this case, that I've read, but it still left me frustrated. Words to describe music is probably better left alone and not done, I feel. Enjoy the music for the music's sake. Don't try and read around it and get analytical or think you can get analytical about it, because you can't. But I will just read one section that I think is worthwhile. And this is about talking about their time in Rock Against Racism in about 1978 and in Leeds. So this is one of the co-founders of Rock Against Racism. He was a GP, a doctor called David Widgery. And indeed, I read his book way back when, which informed me about the whole Rock Against Racism movement. So this is Widgery talking For a while we managed to create in our noisy, messy, unconventional way an emotional alternative to nationalism and patriotism, a celebration of a different kind of pride and solidarity. And this is the actual leader of the British Nazis, a party called the National Front, who were on the rise in the 70s and looked like they could win seats in Parliament. This is his commentary after the election and after the Rock Against Racism movement. He's called Martin Webster. Not one candidate is elected. According to Martin Webster, the head NF organiser, quote, prior to 1977, the NF were unstoppable. Then suddenly the Anti-Nazi League was everywhere and knocked the hell out of them. The sheer presence of the Anti-Nazi League had made it impossible to get National Front members onto the streets, had dashed recruitment and cut away their vote. It wasn't just the physical opposition to the marches, they lost the propaganda war too. And that's in the words of the head Nazi at the time himself. And it's so important right now because last week in London there was a march of far-right and I would say Nazi supporters, which garnered 110,000 people on the street, which is quite a sizable demonstration in London. And you think, well, how do we combat this? How do we turn the tide back? And one thing we can't do is put some sort of cultural movement on the streets to oppose them, like they did in the late 70s, early 80s with Rock Against Racism, because the musicians, the current generation of musicians, just wouldn't be appropriate. They're so unaware. They're not political. I mean, the late 70s was a very political era because, the depression that was happening in the UK. And there were sort of strikes and there was the rubbish was being uncollected in the streets, bodies were going unburied in sort of crematoria, all this sort of stuff. It just wouldn't happen now. Musicians are so sort of narrowly focused on themselves. They have very little political awareness, very little cultural awareness beyond the culture of making money, of selling, in huge units or at least on downloads. And it's very worrying what's happening in the UK. And, one can look back to this book sort of wistfully. And I do look back to Rock Against Racism wistfully. But no, there's not a cat in hell's chance of it, happening today. So we need to find another way. But anyway, so that's it. That's been my reading week, or couple of weeks, I should say. At least one contender for my books of the year, which is very gratifying. Couple of solid reads and then some rather disappointing reads too. But hey, isn't it always like that? So till next time, thanks very much.